I recall it as vividly as if it happened just yesterday. My husband David and I were relaxing in our warm and inviting living room. It was one of those serene evenings when the world feels still, with only the soothing sounds of the crackling fire and the occasional rustling of a blanket breaking the silence. We had been married for 10 years, a decade filled with ups, downs, and everything in between. David was my best friend, my anchor, and my partner in all things, or at least, that's what I believed. That evening, David gave me a look I couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't anger or sorrow. It felt off. Clearing his throat, he began, "Honey, there's something I've been mulling over." Naturally, I prepared myself for the usual topics: financial worries, work stress, or perhaps, though unlikely, talk of a surprise trip. But what he said next left me utterly stunned. "How would you feel about spending time with someone else?" he asked, his tone steady but his eyes avoiding mine. I let out a nervous laugh, waiting for the joke to land. "Spending time? Like with friends?" I asked. "No," he said firmly, his gaze finally meeting mine. "I mean, what if you connected with another man? Just for one night?" For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. This was David, the same man who once became jealous when a waiter seemed overly friendly while taking my order. Now, he was suggesting, what exactly? My face grew hot. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. David leaned forward, speaking softly but with a persistent tone. "I've been reading about something couples do. They bring another person into their relationship to keep things exciting." My stomach turned. Keep things exciting? Was he bored with me? Did he think I wasn't enough? And then he dropped another shocker. "There's this guy I know, Jerome. We work out at the same gym. I think he'd be perfect." I couldn't believe my ears. David had not only thought this through but had someone in mind. Jerome, a man I'd seen only briefly. He was tall, confident, and carried himself with a presence that filled any room. "David, are you out of your mind?" I snapped, standing so quickly the blanket on my lap slid to the floor. "This is absurd!" Yet, David didn't flinch. He remained composed, almost eerily so. "Just think about it," he urged. "I wouldn't bring this up if I didn't believe it could make us closer." Closer? How could this possibly bring us closer? My mind raced with a whirlwind of emotions: disbelief, anger, confusion, and even a hint of curiosity I wasn't ready to acknowledge. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying David's words in my head. Was this suggestion the beginning of the end for us? Or was there something I wasn't grasping? In the days that followed, David didn't mention it again, but his idea lingered, an unspoken tension shadowing our interactions. Just when I thought I'd buried it in the back of my mind, Jerome entered our lives in an unexpected way. Time passed, and I convinced myself David's idea was just a fleeting whim, a strange phase he'd eventually dismiss. Then, one Saturday morning, David announced casually, "Jerome's coming over for dinner tonight." I froze mid-sip of my coffee. "What?" I asked. "He's never had a home-cooked meal since moving here," David explained, sounding far too cheerful. "I thought it'd be nice to invite him over. No pressure, of course. Just dinner." "No pressure," I muttered under my breath, my annoyance and unease rising. This wasn't merely dinner. It was a setup, wasn't it? A way for David to test his outrageous idea. That evening, as I stood in the kitchen chopping vegetables, I tried to mentally prepare for whatever awkwardness lay ahead. The doorbell rang, and I heard David's hearty voice greeting Jerome like an old friend. When I finally stepped out to greet our guest, I froze. Up close, Jerome was even more striking. Tall, broad-shouldered, and exuding effortless confidence. He had a warm smile and kind eyes that lingered on me just a second longer than felt appropriate. "Hi," I managed, forcing a polite smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you," Jerome said, his deep, smooth voice accompanied by a firm handshake. For a moment, I felt an unidentifiable spark. Dinner turned out to be surprisingly enjoyable. Jerome was charming, funny, and an excellent conversationalist. He spoke about his work as a fitness trainer, his passion for cooking, a detail David conveniently hadn't mentioned, and his childhood in a small southern town. Meanwhile, David, uncharacteristically quiet, observed me and Jerome with an intensity that left me unsettled. I tried to focus on being a good hostess, but I couldn't ignore how Jerome's attention seemed to linger. He complimented my cooking, asked about my hobbies, and laughed heartily at my jokes. Too heartily, perhaps. When Jerome finally left, David looked at me with a knowing expression. "He's a great guy, isn't he?" he said. I crossed my arms and shot him a glare. "Don't start, David. It was just dinner." But David persisted. "You two got along so well. Don't you see what I mean now? This doesn't have to be a bad thing." Shaking my head in disbelief, I replied, "Do you even hear yourself? You're practically pushing me toward another man." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not pushing you toward anyone. I want us to be happy, to try something new. Jerome isn't a stranger anymore. He's someone we can trust." His words hung in the air, heavy and deeply unsettling. I couldn't decide what unsettled me more: David's unrelenting determination, or the small, shameful part of me that wondered how it might feel to break free from the boundaries of my meticulously structured life. The next morning, Jerome sent me a message. "Thanks for the wonderful dinner last night. David's lucky to have you." I stared at the screen, my heart racing. Why was he reaching out to me directly? And why did his words stir something inside me? I convinced myself it was harmless. Just a courteous thank you. But deep down, I sensed it was the start of something far more complex. Jerome's text lingered in my mind all day, no matter how hard I tried to dismiss it. It wasn't the content. His words were polite enough. It was the way they made me feel. Flattered. Seen. Like someone had noticed me in a way I hadn't felt in years. Initially, I didn't respond, thinking it was wiser to let it be. But by lunchtime, curiosity got the better of me. I replied with a simple, "Thanks for coming over. Glad you enjoyed it." It seemed innocent enough, right? Nothing more than a polite exchange. Yet when Jerome responded almost immediately with, "You're an amazing host. Can't wait to hang out again," I felt a flicker of guilt. David had no idea we were messaging. While I wasn't exactly hiding it, I wasn't rushing to mention it either. A week later, David brought up Jerome again while we were driving to the grocery store. "You know," he started casually, "Jerome mentioned you two had a nice chat at dinner." My grip on the steering wheel tightened, and I kept my eyes on the road. "It was just small talk. Nothing major," I replied. David nodded but didn't let the subject drop. "He said you're easy to talk to." Thought that was nice. I couldn't tell if David was fishing for something or genuinely trying to nudge me toward his strange idea, but I refused to engage. Later that week, Jerome messaged me again. This time it wasn't the usual polite conversation. "Hey, I'm trying out a new recipe tonight, and it made me think of you since you're such a great cook. Want the recipe?" It seemed harmless enough, so I said yes. One recipe led to a discussion about our favorite dishes, then to sharing childhood stories, and before I knew it, we'd been texting for an hour. I reassured myself there was nothing wrong with it. David knew Jerome and trusted him, and it wasn't as if anything inappropriate was happening. But then Jerome began making comments that stopped me in my tracks. "Wish I had a cook like you around all the time," he wrote one evening. I stared at the message, unsure how to respond. Was he flirting, or was I overthinking it? The real surprise came a few days later. David came home from work, handed me his phone, and said, "Jerome invited us to his place for dinner this weekend." He grinned as he spoke. I took the phone and read the message. It was friendly and straightforward, nothing unusual. But knowing about my private conversations with Jerome, I felt a pang of guilt. "Do you want to go?" David asked. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. Refusing might make things awkward, but agreeing felt just as challenging. Finally, I forced a smile and said, "Sure, why not?" That Saturday, we arrived at Jerome's apartment. It was sleek and modern, with an open layout and large windows that bathed the space in evening light. Jerome greeted us warmly, though his smile lingered on me a bit too long. Dinner was as delicious as he'd promised. He was clearly as skilled a cook as he claimed, but the evening carried an undercurrent I couldn't ignore. Every time Jerome's eyes met mine, it felt as though he was saying something unspoken. David, oblivious as always, seemed to enjoy himself. He even joked about Jerome and me opening a restaurant together. "You'd make a great team," he said, laughing as he sipped his wine. Jerome raised his glass and, locking eyes with me, said, "I'd like that." The words themselves were innocent, but the way he said them sent a chill down my spine. That night at Jerome's stayed with me long after we left. There was something in the way he looked at me, the way he spoke. An intensity that felt charged, like an invisible current running beneath the surface. David, on the other hand, seemed entirely unfazed. On the drive home, he couldn't stop raving about Jerome's cooking and suggested we invite him over more often. "He's a great guy," David said enthusiastically. And he clearly likes you. I nearly choked on my breath. What's that supposed to mean? I asked. David chuckled, his tone light and dismissive. Just that you two get along really well. Isn't that a good thing? I didn't respond, turning to stare out the window. Part of me wanted to yell at him for being so oblivious. Or perhaps he wasn't. Maybe this was all part of his larger plan, the one he'd hinted at weeks ago. The next morning, Jerome messaged me again. Had a great time last night. You looked stunning, by the way. My heart raced as I read his words. It was the first time he'd said something so blatantly flirtatious, and it felt like a boundary had been crossed. I should have ignored it, shut it down immediately. Instead, I found myself typing back, "Thanks, Jerome. Dinner was amazing. You're a fantastic cook." I told myself it was just a compliment, nothing serious. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The texts between Jerome and me became more frequent after that. Little jokes, compliments, and stories about our daily lives filled our conversations. It wasn't physical, but emotionally, it felt like I was walking a tightrope. One evening, while David was out running errands, Jerome called me. Hearing his voice on the other end of the line felt unexpectedly intimate. "I hope I'm not bothering you," he said, his tone warm and smooth. "No, not at all," I replied, though my stomach churned with nerves. We talked for nearly an hour about everything and nothing. By the time the call ended, I felt a mix of exhilaration and guilt I couldn't shake. When David returned home, he noticed immediately that something was off. "Are you okay?" David asked as he set the groceries down. "Yeah, just tired," I replied, avoiding his eyes. But David wasn't convinced. "Are you sure? You seem distracted." "I'm fine," I insisted, forcing a smile. David let it go, but his concern lingered in my mind. For all his flaws and peculiar ideas, he still cared about me. And yet, here I was, caught up in exchanges I knew he wouldn't approve of. The next time David brought up Jerome, it wasn't about food or recipes. It was something far more unsettling. "You know," he began, sitting next to me on the couch, "Jerome said he thinks you're amazing." My heart skipped a beat. "He said that?" David nodded, a peculiar look in his eyes. "He admires your kindness, your humor. He said you're the kind of person who makes others feel comfortable." I didn't know how to respond. Was this David's way of nudging me closer to Jerome, or was he just sharing a compliment? Then he said something that left me speechless. "I think you should spend some time with him, just the two of you." I stared at him, my mouth dry. "What are you talking about?" David leaned back, his expression calm but unreadable. "I trust you, and I think it could be good for us. For you." For a moment, I thought he must be joking, but his serious tone told me otherwise. "David," I said, my voice trembling, "this isn't normal. Couples don't do things like this." "Some do," he countered, "and it makes their relationships stronger." I was at a loss for words. A part of me wanted to scream at him, to tell him he was being ridiculous. But another part, a part I wasn't ready to acknowledge, wondered if he might be right. David's suggestion haunted me for days. Every time I thought about it, my stomach twisted in knots. How could he think this was a good idea, and why was he so persistent? I tried to push it out of my mind, but Jerome made that nearly impossible. His messages became more frequent and more personal. He'd ask about my day, share pictures of the meals he cooked, and occasionally slip in compliments that felt less casual and more deliberate. One evening, as I sat alone scrolling through my phone, Jerome's name lit up my screen again. "I can't stop thinking about the way you smiled at dinner the other night. You have this energy that's hard to ignore." My heart raced as I read the message. This wasn't harmless anymore, and I knew it. Yet I couldn't bring myself to shut it down. I started typing, "Jerome, I don't think this is appropriate." But before I could send it, David walked into the room. "Who are you texting?" he asked, glancing at my phone. "No one," I said quickly, locking the screen and setting it down. David gave me a curious look but didn't push further. Instead, he sat beside me and said, "Jerome mentioned he might stop by this weekend. I told him it's fine." I felt my chest tighten. "David, you're taking this too far." His expression was calm but firm. "Am I? Or are you just afraid of what this could mean for us?" I stood abruptly, unable to sit there and listen to him rationalize something that felt so wrong. "I'm not afraid of anything. I just don't understand why you think this is okay." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just want us to be happy, to explore things we haven't before. You said yourself that life's felt routine lately. Routine. Sure, there were ups and downs, but that didn't mean I wanted to throw away my marriage for some ill-conceived experiment. The tension between us lingered for days. By the time the weekend arrived, I felt like I was balancing on the edge of a cliff, caught between loyalty and temptation. When Jerome arrived on Saturday, I was a bundle of nerves. He greeted David warmly, but when his eyes met mine, his smile was softer, more knowing. Throughout the evening, David seemed determined to make things comfortable. He encouraged Jerome and me to sit together on the couch while he busied himself in the kitchen. At one point, Jerome leaned in and asked, "You seem tense. Are you okay?" I forced a smile. "I'm fine," I lied, but I wasn't fine. I felt trapped in an increasingly impossible situation. When David finally joined us, he carried a bottle of wine. "Let's make a toast," he said, pouring glasses for the three of us. "To new experiences." Jerome's eyes flicked to mine as he clinked his glass against mine. "To new experiences," he echoed. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. David seemed unusually relaxed, almost disturbingly so, while I felt like I was suffocating. By the time Jerome left, I was emotionally drained. That night, lying in bed beside David, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered, my voice breaking. David turned to face me, his expression soft. "Because I love you. And I think this could bring us closer." The word closer echoed in my mind as tears filled my eyes. How could something that felt so wrong possibly bring us closer? I barely slept that night, my mind racing with everything that had happened. David's words repeated over and over. "I love you. I think this could bring us closer." Closer to what? To disaster? The next morning, I woke up feeling like I was drowning. David acted as though nothing had happened, chatting about his plans for the day as he made coffee. Meanwhile, I sat at the table in a fog. And then, as if on cue, Jerome texted, "Good morning, beautiful. I hope today brings you as much joy as you bring others." I stared at the message, my stomach in knots. This had gone too far. I needed to end it, whatever it even was. I typed back, "Jerome, we need to talk." His response was immediate. "Of course. When and where?" After a brief pause, I replied, "Today. Somewhere public. A coffee shop." We agreed to meet that afternoon at a small cafe on the edge of town. I didn't tell David. I didn't even know how to explain it to him without making things worse. When I arrived, Jerome was already there, waiting at a table by the window. He stood as soon as he noticed me, his smile warm and welcoming. "Thanks for meeting me," he said as I took a seat. I nodded, exhaling deeply. "Jerome, we need to address this," I began. He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" he asked. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I replied, my voice unsteady. "The messages, the calls, it's starting to feel like more than just friendly conversation." Jerome leaned back, his eyes fixed on me. "And what if it is?" he asked. His honesty hit me like a blow to the chest. I had expected him to deny it or dismiss it as harmless, but his candor left me speechless. "I'm married," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper, "to a man who seems determined to push us together, and I don't understand why." Jerome's expression softened. "I know, and I respect that. But I also know how I feel when I'm around you, and I think you feel it too." My heart raced as I looked at him, torn between anger, confusion, and something I wasn't ready to name. "I can't do this," I said, shaking my head. "Whatever this is, it's not right." Leaning forward, Jerome's voice was calm but sincere. "I'm not asking you to do anything you're not ready for, but I want you to know that I'm here if you need me." His words were both reassuring and dangerous, and I hated the way they affected me. "I need some distance," I said, standing up. "Please stop texting me." Jerome nodded solemnly. "I understand." As I left the cafe, I felt a strange mix of relief and regret. I had drawn a line, but I wasn't sure how long I could keep it intact. When I got home, David was waiting for me, his arms crossed and a knowing expression on his face. "You met with him, didn't you?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. My heart sank. "How did you know?" I asked. "I saw the messages," he said simply. "And I wanted to see what you'd do." A wave of anger and betrayal washed over me. "You were testing me? Spying on me?" David shook his head. "I wasn't spying. I was trying to understand. And now I see that you're struggling, just like I am." Struggling with what? I snapped. You're the one who started all of this. David sighed, running a hand through his hair. I wanted to shake things up to get us out of this rut, but maybe I went about it the wrong way. His words hung in the air, and for the first time, I noticed a hint of doubt in his expression. I love you, he said softly. I just want us to be happy. Can you believe that? I didn't know how to respond. Everything felt so tangled, so far removed from the life we had built together. Then stop pushing, I finally said, my voice trembling. Let me figure this out on my own. David nodded, his face heavy with emotion. Okay, he said. I'll back off, but please don't shut me out. I turned away, unable to face him any longer. The days that followed were some of the hardest I had ever faced. True to his word, David gave me space, but his presence loomed like a shadow. Every time I looked at him, the weight of everything unspoken hung in the air. And then there was Jerome. Although I had asked him not to contact me, I couldn't stop thinking about him. His words, his warmth, the way he made me feel noticed in a way I hadn't in years. One night, as I sat alone in the living room, mindlessly scrolling through my phone, I stumbled across an old photo of David and me. It was from the early days of our marriage, before things became so complicated, before the spark between us began to fade. I stared at the image, tears welling in my eyes. What had gone wrong? How had we ended up here? The next morning, I woke up determined to confront everything head-on. No more avoidance, no more running. It was time to face the truth. About David, Jerome, and most importantly, myself. I started with David. We need to talk, I said, standing in the kitchen doorway as he poured coffee. He looked up, his eyes a mixture of hope and apprehension. Okay, he said, I'm listening. I took a shaky breath, my hands trembling. I can't do this anymore, I said. The games, the pushing, the expectations, it's not who we are. At least it's not who I want us to be. David set his mug down, his expression serious. I was just trying to help, he said. I wanted to give us something new. I know, I replied, my voice breaking. But you never stopped to think about how it would make me feel. You never asked if it was what I wanted. David nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging. You're right, I didn't, and I'm sorry. His apology caught me off guard, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like we were on the same page. I want to rebuild this with you, I said, tears streaming down my face. But it has to be on our terms, no one else's. David stepped closer, pulling me into a hug. We'll figure it out, he whispered. Together! It was a small moment, but it felt monumental. Later that day, I knew there was one more conversation I needed to have. With Jerome. I sent him a text asking if we could meet one last time. He agreed, and we returned to the cafe where this whirlwind had begun. When he saw me, he smiled, but there was a sadness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. I didn't think I'd hear from you again, he said as I sat down. I took a deep breath, my heart racing. Jerome, I care about you, I began. I really do. But whatever this is, it has to end. He nodded slowly, his gaze steady. I understand. But can I ask you something? Of course, I said. Do you think you'd feel the same if things were different? If the circumstances weren't what they are? His question hit me hard, like a train. The truth was, I didn't know. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the life I had chosen and the vows I had made. I don't know, I admitted. But I can't live in what-ifs. I have to focus on what's real. Jerome gave me a soft smile, though there was sadness in his eyes. You're stronger than you think, he said. As I walked away from the cafe, I felt a bittersweet mix of relief and heartbreak. Letting go wasn't easy, but it was necessary. When I got home, David was waiting. He didn't ask where I'd been, and I didn't offer any explanation. Instead, we sat side by side and began the slow process of rebuilding what we had almost lost.